You're listening to the Archaic Drum Podcast. In-depth conversations with great visionaries and free thinkers of today. Beat by beat, evolving self and society through ancient wisdom and emerging paradigms. With your host, James Benton.
Welcome once again, everyone. This is our 19th episode, recorded on September the 9th, 2014. And today we have with us a legend in the fields of science, consciousness, and spirituality. Peter Russell is a fellow of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, of the World Business Academy, and of the Findhorn Foundation, and an honorary member of the Club of Budapest. At Cambridge University in the UK, he studied mathematics and theoretical physics, where he was mentored directly by Dr. Stephan Hawking. Then, as he became increasingly fascinated by the mysteries of the human mind, he changed to experimental psychology. Pursuing this interest, he traveled to India to study meditation and Eastern philosophy, and on his return took up the first research post ever offered in Britain on the psychology of meditation. In the 1970s, he was one of the first people to introduce human potential seminars into the corporate field, and for 20 years ran programs for senior management on creativity, stress management, personal development, and sustainable development. Clients have included IBM and Apple. In 1982, he coined the term global brain, with his 1980s bestseller of the same name, in which he predicted the Internet and the impact it would have on society. His other books include The TM Technique, The Upanishads, The Brain Book, The Creative Manager, The Consciousness Revolution, Waking Up in Time, and From Science to God. His principal interest is the deeper spiritual significance of the times we are passing through. His work seeks to distill the essence of the world's spiritual traditions and present it in ways relevant to the current times. Peter Russell, welcome.
Nice to be with you.
Well, I appreciate so much you taking the time to speak with me here today. To begin with, I know that one of your primary areas of focus has been in the area of consciousness research, if we can call that research. And you were wise enough, in my view, to undertake, along with your other studies, a contemplative, meditative approach in your search for some understanding. I'm also aware that you had a rather scientifically oriented mind very early in life, and not long after there were some philosophical ideas that you became intrigued with. Was there some particular idea that came to you at that time that had a big influence on your views later, Peter?
There were probably a sequence of ideas, but actually the main idea, and this really cropped up, I suppose, in my mid-teens when I was about sort of 15 or so. As teenagers do, they start waxing philosophical, and I got very interested in what was, often called the mind-brain problem, and it just, back then as a teenager, with, as you say, an interest in science. I was definitely a scientist back then. Mm-hmm. I was studying at school physics, maths, the sciences, and loved it. And the age-old question of how does the mind, as I put it then, consciousness, come out of the brain? And we would have sort of schoolboy debates upon that. So I could see that was a very early beginning to my thinking. And I went on to university and was studying theoretical physics and mathematics, and doing pretty well at it, and got to the stage of really being able to solve Schrodinger's equation, which doesn't mean much to non-physicists, but I think is a great intellectual achievement of mathematics, that you can actually this is the way mathematics describes how the world operates at the quantum level.
Yeah.
And it really, the beginning of how the universe has evolved. And I realized that none of this was ever going to answer this basic question of why is there consciousness? And so that question kept coming back. And I actually, in the end, I went on and did another degree in psychology, experimental psychology, what's now called neuroscience, hoping that would sort of give me an answer. I thought, well, by studying the brain, I can get to know more about consciousness. But the way it was taught, and this is back in Cambridge in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, people weren't really interested in consciousness still. I learned a lot about the brain and memory and the chemistry of what goes on and all of that. And consciousness really came into it. And that's when the sort of contemplative side began to come in, because I realized that the way to study consciousness was not so much sticking electrodes on the skull, but it was the yogis, the meditators who'd sat down quietly and actually began to observe consciousness from the inside. And I realized this is the way you actually study consciousness, is by observing it firsthand. And so I began to get interested in meditation, and that's how the contemplative side started. And then that question kept coming back, over the years, but was now being fed by my own sort of inner studies, as well as, external research considerations, philosophical discussions, but also my own inner research in terms of my own consciousness. And the two began to just come together over the years.
There's much speaking about what I'll call the raising of, or the evolution of consciousness these days. And I've touched on that myself in some of my own writings here. Is there, you think, some precursor of understanding that's needed to be able to begin to open up a bit more for ourselves this thing we call consciousness?
Yes. Actually, before answering that, I suppose one thing is, in some senses, consciousness in the sort of deeper sense of the word consciousness never changes. The fact that, I am conscious, I was conscious when I was a kid, as a teenager. And in a sense, what has evolved is my thinking, my values, my perceptions, what I'm aware of. And I think that's what we're really talking about. I suppose I'm being a bit pedantic, but I think it's something important for me to realize that consciousness as such, in a way, doesn't change. My feeling of being a conscious being is exactly the same as it was all my life. That hasn't changed, but my experiences and awareness, what I'm aware of, changes. And are there precursors for those change? I think it varies from different people. For a lot of people, it's some sort of challenge, crisis of realizing the old way of thinking, the old way of working in the world isn't working, and it comes to a head for them in some way or another. And it could be, some illness, emotional trauma, work, or just looking at how people behave in the world. I think for many people, that's a stimulus to begin to look within and look at, what are the beliefs, the ideas, the mindsets that I'm holding that are leading me to behave in this limited way. So I think ultimately that's what we're talking about with this inner growth, is how to let go of limited ways of seeing, limited ways of operating in the world, which you could basically say come down to sort of the self-centered ego's needs to defend itself, to keep surviving. and how these often get misdirected and so lead us to behave in ways which are really dysfunctional for ourselves and for the community at large.
Yeah.
So I think the precursor, in the most general sense, is realizing the old way isn't working. Though for some people, and this is a much smaller part of the population, sometimes there is no obvious precursor like that. It's just something happens out of the blue. There is these are the people who have this flash of insight, flash of awakening, where suddenly the old drops away completely unexpectedly, and they're left with this very different, much more open, free, more illuminated way of experiencing the world. And for some of those people, it seems to come as a complete surprise, and they don't know what on earth is going on because it just comes out of the blue.
Right. Yeah, it appears that for some of us, there's just no container to hold something that is so far out of our usual modes of functioning. Don't you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because what we're talking about here really is a radical transformation in how we, I was going to say perceive the world, not how we perceive it through the senses, but how we understand it, interpret it, relate to it, and the frame of thinking that we bring to it, what we see is needed, how we value it, how we operate in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's fundamentally just this shift from, not even a shift from, it's like it's a releasing or freeing up from the ego's way of thinking, which is generally about being in control, domination, motivated by fear, to a very different mode, which is about being motivated more by caring and love and allowing rather than controlling, and not being overly concerned about one's own survival, but being free to actually care for the world in a much more open, generous way.
Yeah. And those are qualities that a truly authentic and helpful meditation practice could move us towards, don't you think?
Yes. And I think there's many, many different sorts of meditation. I always feel cautious when we just say meditation because it's a word which is used, it's sort of like an umbrella word to cover many different things. The sorts of meditations that I'm interested in, and I would say this is where the majority of meditations, their approach is about stepping out of the thinking mind in one way or another. And I think thinking is a very, very useful tool. It's made us what we are as human beings. It's incredibly valuable at times. And a lot of the time, we are caught in thinking patterns, which are just, most of them repeats, ideas just going around our head, worrying about things that may never happen, or going over the past again when it's all past. And it's all just these I thoughts. Oh, I should have done that, or what if I did this, or what's so and so going to think of me, or I really like this, I really want this. And when our attention is filled with these thoughts, we sort of get lost in those stories. They're really just stories we're telling ourselves, and most of the time, they're actually a waste of time. But our attention is caught in the stories, and meditation, in one way or another, there's many different ways of doing it, allowing us to step out of that story. And in that, we come back to what you could call our true self, our own being, the natural state of mind, which is one of just much more open perception of the situation that's not colored by what I think I want or need or should do. And so I think that's the value of meditation, is allowing us to repeatedly step out of that egoic thinking and coming back to our own natural state of presence. And through repeatedly doing that and getting more and more familiar with that, to be able to then take that way of functioning out into the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Peter, I hope I'm not leading us down a dead-end path here, but could you give some insight, if there are any insights, into what you've called a meta paradigm, and how does this idea help us to arrive at a better understanding of consciousness? If it will.
Yes. I don't. For me, it's not a blind alley at all. Well, let's just step back and just touch on what we mean by paradigm. It's a word that I think everybody's heard of these days. It's relatively new to Western vocabulary. It was the philosopher of scientific history, Thomas Kuhn, who brought the idea in about 50 years ago. He was looking at the belief systems in science, that science has its belief systems, and he called these paradigms, and they're basically the belief system within which a particular scientific discipline operates. And so, you could say 200 years ago in physics, the belief system is what's now called Newtonian mechanics, where space and time were fixed, and it was almost like a clockwork world. And everybody did their thinking within that paradigm. That was the way that people thought. And then come the beginning of the 20th century with Einstein and Max Planck, the two great revolutions of theory of relativity and quantum theory, both showed that actually Newtonian mechanics was just a very special case that applied to the world we operate in sort of our time scales and size. But when you go to the very small or the very big, the universe didn't work that way. And so the paradigm shifted, and we now live in a world where scientists do their thinking, accepting the implications of relativity, accepting the implications of quantum theory. I mean, every single computer we used is based on quantum theory is how the chips work. We don't always realize that, but it's actually very, very practical. But what Kuhn showed was that we don't change easily. We don't change our minds easily. We hold on to our belief systems about how things are almost stronger than we hold on to any belief system. And that's what he was interested in, how things change. And often there's a problem with the old belief system. We try to incorporate things, like when we used to think the Earth was the center of the universe, and when we noticed, the planets didn't move as they should do, we kept on trying to stretch the old model with these very, very complex systems until, Copernicus came along and said, hey, what if the sun was the center? And everybody, people ridiculed him. Galileo was put under house arrest and Bruno was burnt at the stake. People don't like to change their views. So that was his basic idea. The meta paradigm is, meta, it sort of means beyond. What I mean by the meta paradigm is the paradigm behind all the paradigms. And so today in science, we have paradigms like relativity theory, we have quantum theory, we have DNA, the DNA model in molecular biology. We have many different paradigms in different areas of science. But there's a much deeper belief system within which all science does its work currently. And I say all, there's a few renegades. And that is that the real world is the world of space, time, and matter. And consciousness somehow comes out of that. We don't know how, but somehow consciousness is created by the brain, by nervous systems in some way or another. And that's unquestioned by the vast majority of scientists. They say, of course, that's obvious. Just as 500 years ago we say, people, of course it's obvious the Earth is at the center. We see the sun going round. And so people say, of course it's obvious that, consciousness comes out of the brain. There's some very real problems with that approach, however. And this is, coming back to where I started, there's nothing in modern science, nothing in physics or biology or anything that predicts that any one of us should actually have an internal experience. We can predict how we will function, how our bodies function. We can even predict how, we would react to certain stimuli. Right. But why do we have this internal representation, which we might call, our experience, the mind, consciousness? Why is that there? And one of the tests of any scientific theory is, how well does it predict the outcome?
That's the question.
And we have a whole scientific worldview that doesn't predict consciousness. And yet, the one thing none of us can doubt is that we are conscious. I can doubt, what I'm seeing. I could be seeing illusions, whatever. But whatever I'm experiencing, the fact that I am conscious is undeniable. And so we have what Thomas Kuhn called an anomaly. We have an observation that cannot be denied, and it cannot be explained within the current model. And so, the observation is, I am conscious, and there's no way of explaining it. And this, to me, suggests there's something fundamentally wrong with the very basic assumption of all science, and that's what I call the meta-paradigm, the idea that consciousness somehow arises out of matter, that we need to question that. Mm-hmm. But we are at that stage that Kuhn showed happens again and again. We are sort of in denial. And so we keep on trying to fit the anomaly into the old model. We keep on saying, well, maybe it's this. Maybe it's something in quantum physics can explain consciousness. Maybe it's to do with information theory. Maybe it's brain chemistry. Mm-hmm. We keep grasping at straws, but no one's been able to explain how something as immaterial as conscious experience can come out of unconscious matter. So I see that the meta-paradigm, this deeper assumption about the whole universe, is really being called into question, and we need to really, question these deeper assumptions. So that's what I mean by the meta-paradigm. Sorry, long answer, but...
No, thanks for the explanation. It seems to me that we tend to have the habit of perhaps looking through the wrong microscope at these things, and I guess the question is which is the correct microscope we should be picking up to see this all a bit clearer. I realize that your views have evolved over the years, but if you would permit me, I would like to read, if you don't mind, a passage out of an older book of yours titled Waking Up in Time.
Yep.
What you wrote here over 20 years ago, it seems, I found to be a rather astonishingly accurate description of just what's occurring in the world today. I was rather stunned, actually, when I came across this in light of what we're now experiencing. It's a small section called A Disease of the Future. You wrote, "The problem of stress is not likely to go away. As the pace of change continues to increase, the demands on us will also increase. We will have to make more decisions and faster, have to learn new skills, adapt to new situations, and cope with new threats. As a result, we will find ourselves becoming more tired, making more mistakes, becoming more hostile, more anxious, more depressed, suffering more ill health, and having more accidents. If we are to survive in an ever-accelerating world, it is imperative that we learn to cope with increasing pressures of change without accumulating yet more tension and all its unwanted effects. If we do not, it is more than probable that we will find ourselves sucked into a downward spiral, desperately trying to manage in an increasingly unmanageable world. breakdowns and burnouts will become the norm, and society will head yet faster toward its own collapse. Well, this is playing out to the T, Peter, as you described it. And I know you've already touched on some probable solutions here, but I just wonder how much further down this track we're going to get before we fully realize that there needs to be some new decisions made. What do you think?
This is, it's a subject which continues to fascinate me. I mean, yes, I wrote that. That was about 20 years, or a bit more, that first came out, that book. First, that passage was first in a very similar book called The White Hole in Time. And I would say it's still very, very true for me, what you say. I mean, it was interesting listening to you read it because I haven't sort of framed it to myself. Those are the words I framed it back then. And I just felt, wow, yes, I think there's several things here. I think it is inevitable because it's to do with the accelerating pace of change, which is a completely natural part of any evolutionary process. And in fact, in that book, I spell out how acceleration has been going on more or less since life began. And what we're witnessing today is just that latest stage. And it's a natural part of evolution. It's positive feedback. Developments keep on making things easier. So today, the whole computer revolution, the internet is making things go faster and more. We've got more software to adapt to. There's changes are happening everywhere faster and faster. It's inevitable. This is the first one. It's inevitable. And stress is basically, you define stress as our failure to adapt to change. And so if we don't really develop ourselves in any way, we are going to just become increasingly stressed and break down, as that passage made out. And I would add, the same is happening with the world around us. I would say a lot of the problems in the environment generally they come down to the accelerating rate of change of technology, consumption, pollution. Is the planet cannot cope with this accelerating change. So that's also feeding in. The planetary system is coming under stress as well.
It certainly is.
And then there's the question you bring up of our own awakening and its role in all of this. And I think that really our awakening is obviously, from what we said before about stepping out of the ego's way of thinking into a more open global way of thinking, is certainly going to help us change some of our behaviors. Although I think change is still going to be accelerating, but we can maybe behave in better ways. But I think the fundamental thing here is how does inner change affect our ability to cope with increasing change? And I think there's two things that are important here. Is we need, first of all, increasing stability in ourselves, which means that when some new change comes along, the stock market crashes yet again, or whatever it is, we don't throw up our hands in despair and jump out the window. It's like, okay, here's another change, but we actually are able to remain in touch with our own center. And it's the ego mind that takes us off. The ego mind gets caught up in fear. Oh my God, what now? It's the end of the world, whatever. It's just a story we're telling ourselves. And the more we can develop that ability to stay centered in ourselves and not get caught up in the story, that is going to help us immensely. And a second thing is to be more flexible and creative in our thinking. If we hold on to our old ways of doing things, the solutions we've done in the past, what we think is right or wrong, that's just going to increase the stress. As I say, stress is about adaptation, and adaptation is about being flexible in how we approach things, how we look at things. And an analogy I often use is like a tree in a forest facing a storm. And I think, you know, the analogy here is we have a storm of change coming. People talk about the winds of change. We have a storm of change coming.
Yeah.
And I lived in a forest for a long while, and I think this is why this sort of appeals to me. And I would live through storms, and it's like the trees, you know, a tree that survives a storm, strong roots. If it's rooted in the ground strongly, it can take it. But that's not enough. It also needs flexibility in the branches. It needs to be able to bend with the wind. And I think that's what we need. We need to be sort of strongly grounded, rooted in ourselves, our own reality, so that we're not thrown around by the change. And we're flexible. We can adjust to it and say, okay, this is how it was in the past. This is the new reality. Let me look at this new reality fully in the face and see what is needed here. How do I respond? So, and I think both of those aspects come from doing the inner work of stepping out of the ego thinking and coming back to our true self.
Yeah, continuing on with this idea of, well, that particular idea you just finished with, and any sort of awakening that might occur for anyone. I know that we both have a mutual respect for a great modern day teacher named Adyashanti. And all these hypotheses, theories, and speculations that we see thrown around concerning some of these matters come to mind when I reflect back on something he said once. And I paraphrase here a bit because I don't remember the exact place I read or heard this from him. But he stated once in some way that awakening had more to do with one falling flat on their faces than having some exalted mystical experience of any sort. I know this isn't such a pleasant or romantic view of enlightenment or whatever you want to call it for an individual, but I feel like there's some truth in that, you know, that there needs to be some sort of dropping away or allowing something to fall away, which might feel like we're falling on our faces. What do you think about that statement?
Yes, I think probably a couple of thoughts, probably more. I think we had this old idea of enlightenment, and I saw, this happened to me when I first started coming across spiritual teachings, Eastern teachings. I put enlightenment or awakening, whatever you want to call it, up on some pedestal. That here was going to be some amazing, new, perhaps flashy, wonderful experience, state of consciousness where I would see all these things and understand all these things. It was going to be some, we put up with some amazing new experience, and seeing that as something to strive for or work towards or something we would gain. It was like something was going to happen to us. And I think over the years for me, and I think I would say also for our culture as a whole, this has gradually been, the layers of this have been peeled away and peeled away and peeled away. And Adyashanti is one of, I would say, a whole new school of what we sometimes call non-dual teachers on the planet. But there's an awakening been going on the last 10 years of people who've put in their time. They've done their 30, 40 years of spiritual practice. And we're all coming to the same realization that it's much, much simpler than that. It's basically as you say, it's a letting go, something dropping away, and it's basically what we talked about earlier. For me, it's a dropping away of the ego mind, and it's almost the ego mind that gets attached to, oh, I am going to get enlightened. Enlightenment's going to happen to me. Everything's going to be okay when I get enlightened, and realizing that's just another story. And it's like the dropping away of everything, all those stories, and just falling flat on your face. You could interpret that as like falling on the ground, hurtful, or like some, painful experience. And there may be that aspect to it. But for me, there's another side of that, which is just coming directly in contact with reality as it is. Yeah. And it's that dropping away of all the stories, the structures we hold, are just like, this is it. This is me here in this moment, and not even me. I mean, that sense of individual me-ness just drops away. It's like, this is it. And the freedom that comes from that. And I think what I'm fascinated by is how collectively, I think we are coming to this realization that it's a lot simpler than we thought. And because it's a lot simpler, it's a lot easier than we thought. I mean, you don't find so many contemporary teachers, the Adyashanti and people like that, say, oh, well, what you've got to do is you've got to do 3 years of this practice, then do this practice, and then do this, and maybe after 15 years you're ready for this. And if you really devote yourself and dedicate yourself and really lucky, you might get it this lifetime.
Good luck, buddy.
And more and more, it's just like, hang on, no. You can actually wake up right now if you really can truly let go. You may go back to sleep again in 5 minutes, but it's right here. It's right here now. It's not a question of lots and lots of complex esoteric techniques. That whole idea is, I think, dropping out and realizing it's still a challenge because we are so caught in the old ways of being and thinking. It's not easy in the sense that it just happens. Oh yes, just like that. But it's easy in the sense it's not actually difficult or takes great discipline. It's almost the opposite. And that's why I think teachers, like Adyashanti and others, it's like by just listening to them, and they're just what so many of these teachers are doing, all they're doing is describing how it is, how it is for them once things have dropped away, once they've fallen flat on their face, how it is for them, and the freedom, the compassion, whatever it is, the liberation that comes from that. Just by them talking about that almost over and over again from different points of view, it resonates with our own inner knowing of that. And it's like it shakes away the layers of our own thinking. And for me, this is how it touches something. It's like, oh, yes, of course. This is what they're pointing to. And it's something I know already, but I don't pay much attention to. I mean, when people talk about the true self, I used to think, oh, the pure self, the true self, this is something I'm going to find and discover. It's going to be something very different. And realizing, no, it's just this deep, deep sense of I-ness that's been there all my life, which I cannot define, but I never notice because I'm so busy going through the ego, what it thinks, doing this, doing that, following my thoughts. I never pause to notice that sense of presence, which is always there and always been there.
Well, what you say here reminds me of some time I spent in India back in the mid-90s with a great teacher by the name of Punjaji, or we called him Papaji.
Ah, yes.
And Papaji would say things like, call off the search, or he would say, just stop. these were like the highest teachings for me that I'd ever heard from anyone, as simple as they were.
Yeah.
Just call off the search, man. It's here.
Yes.
You don't need to look any further.
Yes.
So,
and I think these are the highest teachings. This is what more people are recognizing. Yeah. Well, I sometimes say myself, one of my little mantras is, seek and ye shall not find. And the point of that is that it's the very attitude of seeking that takes us away from actually what it is we're seeking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As soon as we get caught up in seeking, we're wanting, the mind starts getting tense, contracted, focusing on something. And what we're really talking about here is the mind that has completely let go and relaxed. And a seeking mind doesn't let go and relax.
Yeah, sometimes I really wonder if there is a purpose in what I'll call here the egoic obstacles. If we're working from the presumption of there's a purpose to each manifestation in life. I know I've considered more than once that perhaps there was some sort of screw up in the creation or the evolution of the human mind. And I'm often rather astonished when I witness the capacities we have to delude ourselves in certain ways. What do you think about that, Peter?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that. Firstly, I think the egoic process is a completely natural and important process. People say, "Oh, we must get rid of the ego. It's evil. It's dangerous. It's the barrier." I think its roots are they're here to help us. It's here to help us survive. If we're faced with some challenge, there's some need, there's some threat, whatever it is, we're hungry, or whatever it is, there's something threatening our life, or whatever it is, we need to go into a mode of thinking. Says, okay, here am I, biological organism. I need to take care of something. I need to get something, change something. Let me work out how to do it so that I feel safer, I'm more secure, my survival is not necessarily guaranteed, but it's going to increase my chance of survival. A very natural mode of thinking to get into, and it's helped us enormously. But we only need to be in that state in our culture very occasionally. Most of our needs and dangers are taken care of. So, but nevertheless, we've got caught in that mode of thinking unnecessarily. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that we've become so good at changing the world. We can create almost anything we want. That if we're not happy, if we're feeling discontent about something, dissatisfied, we're feeling unhappy, frustrated, bored, whatever it is, we immediately fall into the default position of the ego's way of thinking, which is, I need to do something about this. I need to change the world. I need to get something, make somebody respond in a different way, whatever it is. So we sort of blindly have fallen into this way of thinking, this very useful, I would say necessary way of thinking. We fall into it by default when it's not necessary. And secondly, the whole of our culture reinforces that. Almost everything you read, in almost everything in the media, books, the internet, whatever it is saying basically the way to happiness is through what you have or do. It's continually reinforcing it because the massive people who run the media, they don't know any better. We're all caught in this mode, and so it is just reinforced time and time again. And I sometimes think it's like we're hypnotized into this way of thinking.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if we had a world where the continual messages that came through advertising and everything were, hang on, you don't need to do things. If you actually let go and totally relaxed, and you'd find the peace, the satisfaction you're seeking. Don't go out there chasing things. But we get those messages in spiritual texts or some contemporary psychological texts, but they are still a small proportion of the messages that are being fed to us day in and day out.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's so. Peter, I see you offer a type of meditation course or some teachings on your website. Is that correct?
Yes, I have an online meditation. Well, I have several meditations, but the primary thing I've been doing recently is an online meditation course. It's not an online course where it's live, but people sign up for it, and then they get a series. It's 5 lessons at the moment. Well, there's actually a 6th lesson now. It's a series of lessons which are sent to you each week, and it's a progressive series of lessons focused around the idea of letting go of any effort or trying in meditation, which we've been touching on here. Because what I've learned over the years is that the greatest impediment to meditation is trying to make it happen, expecting something to happen, the idea that if you're not doing very well, you need to try harder. Whereas my experience of teaching meditation over the years is if you're not getting good results from the meditation, it's almost invariably because you're trying in some way or other. And so this series of lessons is geared towards taking out any attitude of wanting, trying, expectation, focusing the mind, all towards this goal of learning how to just let the mind totally relax into the present moment, stepping out of the egoic thinking back into our natural presence.
Wonderful. Well, I haven't looked closely at that teaching that you offer there, but I will say that I've heard you speak about meditation and what it is essentially, and your views on how to approach it. I saw you speaking with Eckhart Tolle about this, and I just thought it was a brilliant and very helpful explanation.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a good discussion we had. Yeah.
Of what that is. So I would, from the information I've gathered, I believe that I could recommend this approach. So if someone's in need, check that program out, because I think it's going in the right direction.
Yes, in that program, the name if people are looking for it is just called How to Meditate Without Even Trying.
Nice. Peter, is there anything else you'd like to leave us with in relation to what we've been discussing here today before we sign off?
There's one thing which we sort of just edged upon. I mean, it's like what we all want ultimately is to be at peace, to be happy. We're striving to avoid pain, avoid suffering. We're striving basically to feel okay inside. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah.
And so often in our relationships, we end up attacking the people we're with in some way or another. With personal relationships, work relationships, business, social. And this just really gets in the way of everything, because what happens is if I feel attacked by somebody, if I'm not really careful, I'm going to sort of be defensive and attack them back. And we move into a sort of vicious spiral of people just, attacking each other. It's a very strange pattern we get into. It's like saying, I want to feel okay. I want to feel loved and respected. You're not loving and respecting me enough. Therefore, I'm going to attack you. So that you feel sorry and are much nicer to me. And it basically does not work. No. And it's the principle which, I call it just the principle of kindness, in the sense of recognizing we are all of the same kind. We all want to be loved, respected, to be at peace. So let us strive in any of our interactions, communications. Let us have the intention of, how can I do this, say this, so that the people involved, the other people involved, feel supported by it rather than feel attacked.
Yeah.
And I know that when I do this in my relationships, it changes everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the more we can just practice this in the world, the more things will change. It's the old golden rule that's in every single spiritual tradition, which basically says, treat others as you would like to be treated.
Yeah, exactly. Peter, are there any events or appearances lined up you have that we should know about? I see that you're going to be presenting at the Science and Non-Duality Conference this year. When does that take place?
That takes place in San Jose in Northern California. It's a wonderful conference of a lot of contemporary spiritual teachers, but also scientists, really looking at the whole nature of consciousness. I have a huge number of speakers there. I'm going to be doing an opening workshop on basically on the whole thing of freeing ourselves from the ego mind, looking at how the ego mind arises and how we can actually just allow it to dissolve again. So just getting clear on that. And then I'm doing a presentation on my views on science and consciousness, what we touched upon it with the meta paradigm, but then looking at the new paradigm that I see is emerging. That's a sort of fairly big event. I have some other sort of minor events coming up in the area, but that's about it for this year. I'm sort of in a more fallow writing period at the moment.
Great.
Well, there's another Science and Consciousness conference coming up in the Shivananda Ashram in the Bahamas in the spring. I think it's at the end of April, beginning of May sometime. But if people want to,
aware of that.
They can go to my website, which is just peterrussell.com, with 2 hours on the Russell, or else you end up somewhere else. But you just go to peterrussell.com, and not only is my meditation and lots of other writings and things there, but there's a calendar there which lists where I'm speaking on any public events.
Wonderful. Well, I'll be sure to post your link on my webpage. And if anyone would be interested in learning more about your works, I see that your books, along with presentations available on both DVD and audio files as well, is that right? Are available on your website.
Yes, yeah. And lots of other things just streaming on my website. I mean, there's physical DVDs and CDs and things, but there's books, but there's hundreds of pages of articles and probably, 50 different recordings of talks, presentations and things.
Peter Russell, thank you for this fascinating conversation today.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. It's nice to have a just gentle conversation around such, I think, important topics.
Well, it was my pleasure. Have a great day there, and I hope that we're able to speak again at some point.
Yes, I look forward to that.
Okay, bye for now.
Okay, bye.
We are able to continue these conversations through your generous contributions. If you've enjoyed this dialogue or any of our other episodes, please consider making a donation on our podcast page at www.archaicdrum.com. Also, make sure to sign our mailing list for updates on future episodes and other content on our website. And thanks so much again for listening.